In September of 1971, on a Tuesday morning that smelled like cut hay and coming rain, the Shelby County Equipment Auction outside of Harlan, Iowa, drew maybe 200 people to a field behind the Grange Hall. They came the way farmers always come to auctions, early, quiet, with their hands in their pockets and their eyes moving across every piece of iron in the yard, before the auctioneer had said a single word. There were good machines in that auction. A nearly new International 1066 with low hours. A grain drill that had been properly stored. 3 sets of field cultivators that somebody had kept painted. The kind of equipment that made men pull out their checkbooks and start doing arithmetic in the margins of the sale bill. And then there was the Oliver 88. It sat at the far end of the row away from everything else, as if the consignors had been slightly embarrassed to park it next to the respectable machinery. It had been sitting behind a collapsed hay barn on the Kessler place for the better part of 6 years, and it looked like every one of those years had been hard ones. The hydraulics were seized solid. The clutch was gone. The rear tires had cracked down to the cords. Rust had eaten through the fenders so completely that you could have pushed your thumb through the metal in half a dozen places. The seat was missing entirely, just a bare mounting plate with 4 bolts pointed at the sky, like a question nobody wanted to answer. There were bird nests in the air cleaner, mouse damage in the wiring harness, a wasp colony that had set up permanent residence inside the exhaust pipe and seemed to have no intention of relocating. The auctioneer was a man named Bud Cressy, who had been calling sales in western Iowa for 22 years and had developed an honest relationship with the truth about machinery. When he got to the Oliver, he paused the way a man pauses before delivering news he would rather not deliver. "Next item," Bud said. 1948 Oliver 88. He cleared his throat. "Gonna be straight with you folks. This one has been sitting a while. Hydraulics are locked. Clutch is shot. Tires are done. Engine does not turn over by hand, so make of that what you will. Somebody give me $25 for the weight. Rear end alone is worth that for scrap. Nobody moved. $25. Come on, people. That is scrap price. Cast iron is worth something." A man in a green jacket near the back raised one finger. That was Elmer Pruitt. He ran a salvage operation south of town, and he had driven over that morning specifically to pick up whatever the legitimate buyers left behind. His interest in the Oliver was purely mathematical. He would haul it to his yard, pull the good castings, and sell the rest by the pound. 25 from the salvage man. "Do I hear 30-40, said a woman's voice. Bud Cressy looked up from his clipboard. Elmer Pruitt turned around. The 200 people standing in that field turned around. Because a woman's voice at a farm equipment auction in Shelby County in 1971 was still something that made heads swivel. She was standing near the back of the crowd, 33 years old, canvas work jacket, boots that had seen real work and showed it, dark hair pulled back. She was not tall. She was not trying to look like anything in particular. She was simply standing there, with her arms at her sides and her eyes on the Oliver 88. The way you look at something you have already decided about. The man standing closest to her was Frank Stover. Frank ran Stover Equipment, the John Deere dealership on the east side of Harlan. He was wearing a vest over a collared shirt, leather boots with a heel, and the particular expression of a man who considers himself an authority in the room. 40 minutes earlier, Frank had completed the paperwork on a brand new John Deere 4020 sold to a farmer named Gene Tilson. And he was feeling the pleasant confidence of a man who has just done $6,500 worth of business before 10 in the morning. Frank looked at the woman who had just bid $40 on the worst piece of equipment in the auction yard. Then he looked at the Oliver. Then he looked back at the woman. And he laughed. Not a small laugh. A laugh loud enough for the people standing near him to hear it clearly. $40, Frank said. That is the most expensive firewood in Shelby County today. A few people around him smiled. Someone chuckled. The way people do when someone with confidence says something dismissive. It takes very little to make a crowd agree with the person who is already smiling. Bud Cressy looked at Elmer Pruitt. Elmer looked at the Oliver. He had paid $35 in gas money to drive over from his salvage yard. At $40, the economics of hauling a frozen Oliver 88 across Shelby County stopped making sense. He shook his head once and put his hand back in his pocket. Sold, Bud said. $40. To the lady near the back. Nora Caldwell walked forward to sign the paperwork. Now let me stop here for a moment, because I need to tell you something that not one person in that field knew. Not Bud Cressy. Not Elmer Pruitt. Not Frank Stover, who was still smiling at his own joke. Not the 200 people who had just watched a woman buy a piece of rust and frozen metal for $40. The engine that was going into that Oliver 88 had been sitting in Nora Caldwell's shop for 14 months. 14 months. While everyone in that field was looking at a woman making what appeared to be a strange and impulsive purchase, they were actually watching the final move in a plan that Nora had been working on since July of 1970. The auction was not the beginning of the story. The auction was the last step before the work started. And Nora Caldwell had been ready to start that work for over a year. Let me tell you about Nora Caldwell, because what she did in the months and years that followed only makes sense if you understand where she came from and what she had already decided about the world before that Tuesday morning in September. Nora was born in 1938 on a 200-acre farm west of Harlan. Her father was a man named Harlan Caldwell, and Harlan Caldwell was the kind of farmer who made every decision slowly, carefully, and in cash. He did not have a philosophy about debt the way some men have philosophies. He simply lived as if borrowed money was a form of weather you could choose to stay out of. Most people chose to walk in the rain when it came. Harlan kept a roof over everything he owned. He kept a shop behind the farmhouse. Nothing that would have impressed anyone from the outside. A concrete floor poured in 1931 that had developed a long diagonal crack sometime in the 1940s and had not been repaired because the crack did not affect the floor's ability to hold the weight of a tractor. A wood stove in the corner that burned whatever wood came to hand. A workbench along the north wall that Harlan's own father had built from oak planks in 1919 and which had not moved an inch since the day it was set in place. Tools everywhere. On pegboards, in drawers hanging from nails driven into the studs at intervals that made sense to a man who used them every day. Wrenches that had the grip marks of 3 generations worn into the handles. A vise bolted to the bench that had been in the same position since before the First War. Harlan had 4 children, 3 boys and Nora. The boys were Gerald Lewis and Harold. All 3 worked the farm through high school, and all 3 found their way to town by their early 20s. Gerald went to the packing plant in Council Bluffs. Lewis spent time in the service. Harold took a job at a machine shop in Des Moines where he discovered that he preferred working on equipment that belonged to other people equipment he could hand back at the end of the day. Nora stayed, not because she had no other option. That part is important. In the summer of 1956, Nora Caldwell was 18 years old, and she had been accepted to the Teachers College in Cedar Falls. She had the grades for it. She had the letters of recommendation from teachers who meant every word they wrote. She had a suitcase packed and a bus ticket dated for the 2nd week of August. And then Harlan's heart started causing trouble. The doctor in Harlan told him to slow down. Harlan told the doctor that slow and farming were 2 words that did not go comfortably together. The doctor wrote things in a file and looked at Harlan the way doctors look at farmers who are not going to listen. Harlan drove home and went back to work. Nora unpacked the suitcase. She put the bus ticket in the top drawer of the desk in the front room. She wrote a letter to the teacher's college explaining that her circumstances had changed and asking if she could defer her enrollment for 1 year. The college said yes. The following summer came and went. Harlan's heart was no better. Nora wrote another letter. The college said yes again with slightly less enthusiasm. The summer after that, she did not write a letter. She had understood by then that she was not deferring anything. She was making a decision. She just had not said it out loud yet. By 1960, when she was 22 years old, Nora was running the daily operation of the Caldwell farm, in everything except the paperwork that still had Harlan's name on it. The cattle chores were hers. The field decisions were hers. The maintenance schedule was hers. Harlan moved from participant to supervisor, sitting in a lawn chair outside the shop door in good weather, offering corrections that came less frequently as the years passed. Not because Nora needed fewer corrections, because Harlan was learning something about his youngest child that he had not expected to learn. She was better at this than he was. She had the same instinct he had for what a machine was trying to tell you when it ran rough, or pulled to one side, or left a pattern in the soil that was not quite right. But she also had something Harlan had not fully developed until he was well into his 40s. She saw waste the way a hawk sees a mouse in tall grass. From a distance, with complete clarity, without any hesitation about what to do next. It was not stinginess. Harlan knew the difference between stingy and precise, and his daughter was precise. Every dollar that left the farm without earning its place was an offense to her. Not emotionally, practically. She kept a ledger, a handwritten ledger in a composition book where she tracked every expense down to the dollar and every repair down to the hour it took. Not because she enjoyed bookkeeping, because the ledger told the truth, and Nora Caldwell had a strong preference for the truth over the more comfortable alternative. Harlan died in the spring of 1964. He was sitting at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning with a cup of coffee in his hand when his heart, which had been declining for 8 years, with great patience finally stopped. He was 61 years old. He died with his boots on, which would have pleased him if he had been in a position to be pleased by things. He left Nora the farm, 200 acres clear of any mortgage, the cattle, the equipment, the shop with everything in it, and a savings account at the Shelby County Savings Bank that held $14,000, which was a remarkable sum for a man who had farmed 200 acres in western Iowa through the Depression, through the war years, through the difficult decade of the 50s, and had done it all without ever once borrowing money. He did not have a specific plan to repay ahead of schedule. The $14,000 was proof. It was not luck and it was not inheritance. It was the physical evidence of a philosophy lived out over 40 years. Every dollar Harlan Caldwell had not spent on interest payments was a dollar that stayed in the account. And the account had 40 years of not spending interest payments in it. Nora was 26 years old. She was the sole owner of a paid-for farm, with no mortgage, no equipment loans, and no partners. Her brothers called and offered to help. She thanked them and said she would reach out if she needed anything. She did not reach out. She had one thing she kept from her father. One line she carried forward from every conversation she had ever had with him in that shop. Every evening they had spent side by side over a machine that needed to be understood before it could be fixed. She kept it the way you keep something that is too useful to set down. A paid-for tool and a paid-for field are the only things a bank cannot take from you. That was it. That was the whole philosophy. Everything else followed from that one sentence the way rows follow a good first furrow. Now, let me tell you about the summer of 1970. because this is where the story of the $40 Oliver actually begins. In July of 1970, Nora drove 60 miles north to Carroll County to look at a farm liquidation sale. She had read the listing in the agricultural paper, and one item had caught her attention: a Clark Bobcat skid loader with a blown transmission. The listing said the engine was in running condition. It was the transmission that had killed the machine. Nobody wanted a skid loader without a transmission. A skid loader without a transmission was an expensive and inconvenient doorstop. The bidding on it had been so unenthusiastic that the auctioneer had practically apologized for including it in the sale. What Nora saw when she looked at that listing was not a skid loader with a blown transmission. What Nora saw was the engine. The Clark Bobcat in that listing was fitted with a Continental F244, a flathead 6-cylinder gasoline engine, 244 cubic inches, factory rated at 50 horsepower. It was a different kind of engine than most of the equipment in that part of Iowa was running. 50 horsepower in a package that was well built, simple in its engineering, and fundamentally honest about what it was and what it could do. Nora knew this engine. She had read about it. She had looked at the specs in the parts catalogs she kept on the shelf in the shop. She knew its dimensions. She knew its mounting configuration. She knew its flywheel housing dimensions to within a quarter inch. She also knew something else. She had been thinking about the Oliver 88 for over a year. Not any specific Oliver 88. The design, the architecture. Because the Oliver 88 had something that very few row-crop tractors of that era had in the same measure. It had a rear end that its own designers had overbuilt by a comfortable margin. The transmission was a 6-speed with a live power takeoff, and the final drives were heavy cast-iron housings with bull gears machined to tolerances that would have been excessive for the engine Oliver had chosen to put in front of them. The gears could handle significantly more torque than the original engine ever delivered. Oliver had built the drivetrain for durability so thoroughly that the machine's weakest points were everywhere, except the place where the work actually happened. The engine was adequate, the drivetrain was exceptional, and the Continental F244 would make 50 horsepower in a platform that the Oliver's drivetrain could absorb without complaint. The problem was making them fit together. The Continental's mounting feet were spaced differently than the Oliver's engine bay. The flywheel housing had a different bolt pattern. The pilot bore for the transmission input was a different dimension. These were not small problems. They were engineering problems. They required precise solutions. Nora had spent 2 weeks in her father's shop that previous summer, with catalogs, a measuring tape, and sheets of graph paper, working out whether those problems had solutions. She had measured distances and calculated clearances and drawn diagrams until she was certain of the answer. The answer was yes. The problems had solutions. The solutions required an adapter plate machined to connect the Continental's flywheel housing to the Oliver's transmission input custom engine mounts, fabricated from plate steel, and enough patience to do both of those things correctly the first time. Nora had all three. She drove to the Carroll County auction in her pickup truck. She bid $60 on the Clark Bobcat skid loader, and the bidding stopped there because she was the only one who wanted it. She pulled the Continental engine out of the skid loader that same afternoon in the seller's yard, loaded it into her truck bed on a wooden pallet she had brought for that purpose, and left the rest of the machine where it sat. She drove the 60 miles home with 50 horsepower of Continental engine. Riding in the bed of her truck, went straight to the shop and set it on a stand she had already prepared in the corner. She went through the engine that fall. New rings, new bearings, a valve job, fresh gaskets. It took her the better part of 3 months, working evenings after the day's farm work was done. Parts cost her $67. When she was finished, the Continental sat on its stand in the corner of Harlan's shop and waited. 14 months it waited. And then on a Tuesday morning in September of 1971, Bud Cressy's voice carried across the Shelby County auction yard, and Nora Caldwell said $40, and Frank Stover laughed. Let me tell you about Frank Stover, because you cannot understand this story without understanding what Frank represented, and what he represented was not unusual. Frank was not a bad man in the way that requires explaining. He was not cruel. He was not dishonest in any way that would have troubled a judge. What Frank was certain. He was deeply, comfortably, performatively certain that he understood the direction things were moving, and that the direction things were moving was away from old iron and toward new iron, away from machines that you fixed yourself and toward machines that you brought to a dealer, away from the kind of farmer who kept equipment running with fabricated parts and borrowed tools, and toward the kind of farmer who signed financing agreements and took delivery of things that still had the shipping grease on them. Frank made his living from that certainty, and men who make their living from a particular belief have a strong professional interest in that belief being correct. He had been selling John Deere equipment in Shelby County for 11 years. He knew every farmer in the county by name and by the size of his operation and by the approximate state of his finances. He had a gift for understanding what a man wanted to hear about himself, which is the most useful gift a salesman can have. He could make a farmer feel like buying a new tractor was not a financial decision, but a statement about the kind of operation he was running and the kind of future he intended to build. The old iron is done, Frank would say. The farmer's still running M's and 88s. They are the ones selling out by the end of the decade. You can see it coming if you are willing to look. Men who heard this from Frank often nodded slowly the way men nod when someone has articulated something they were already afraid of. And then they would sit down with Frank and work out the numbers on a new 4020 or a new 4320. And the monthly payment would feel manageable in a way that the full price never quite did. And they would drive home in something new with the quiet anxiety that comes from having committed to something large. Gene Tilson had done exactly this that same morning. Gene farmed 400 acres to the north of the Caldwell place. He was a capable farmer, careful in most things, but he had listened to Frank's argument about the direction of the industry for 2 seasons and had arrived at the conclusion that the argument was correct. He had signed the papers on the 4020 that morning, and he was feeling the particular mixture of excitement and unease that accompanies a major purchase. After the auction, as Nora's 2 brothers helped her winch the Oliver onto a borrowed trailer, Gene walked over and stood at the edge of the ramp and looked at what was being loaded. He did not say anything right away. Farmers look at things before they speak. It is a habit that comes from a life of needing to understand what you are seeing before you say something incorrect about it. That has been sitting behind Kessler's barn for 6 years. Gene finally said. Nora wrapped the winch chain around the front axle. It has, she said. Gene looked at the frozen hydraulics, the cracked tires, the bare mounting plate where a seat used to be, the rust that had made the sheet metal look like something the earth was trying to reclaim. What are you going to do with it? Fix it. Gene thought about that for a moment, with what he said. It needs everything. Nora tightened the chain. Then I will fix everything, she said. Gene looked at her for a moment. Then he walked back to his truck. He was not mocking her. Gene Tilson was not a man who mocked people. He was simply trying to understand what he had just witnessed. Which is the appropriate response when you see something that does not fit your existing map of the world? The borrowed trailer pulled out of the auction yard, with the Oliver groaning on the deck. Metal settling against metal, the sound of a machine that had not moved under any power for the better part of 6 years. Frank Stover watched it go from across the yard. He had another customer to see that afternoon. A man in Minden who was thinking about a new disc chisel, and he had already moved on to thinking about that conversation. The story of the $40 Oliver reached the feed store by Thursday. It reached the co-op by Friday. It reached the diner on the highway by Saturday morning. And at every stop, the story added a detail or a laugh the way stories do when they travel through a county where people know each other well enough to enjoy the same jokes. Ruth Hadley bought the Oliver nobody wanted. A woman paid $40 for it. The one behind Kessler's barn with the wasp nest in the exhaust. Bud practically apologized for listing it, and she still bought it. $40. For a pile of rust that hasn't moved since Johnson was president. The name in the story was wrong, but the story was right. And the county laughed with the particular comfortable laughter of people who believe they understand what they are seeing. They did not understand what they were seeing. What they were seeing was a 33-year-old woman who had spent 14 months preparing for a moment that lasted 4 seconds, who had driven 60 miles to buy an engine that nobody else recognized as an engine yet, who had gone through that engine down to the last bearing and put it back together, better than it had come from the factory, who had calculated the geometry of an adapter plate that did not yet exist, and determined that it was possible to build one with the tools she already had, who had looked at a machine that the county saw as garbage and seen instead the one component of that machine that its own designers had been proud of: the rear end, the drivetrain, the bull gears and final drives that were waiting for more power than they had ever been given. Nora Caldwell had paid $40 for those bull gears. Everything else was already in her father's shop. Let me tell you about that shop. Because the shop is the other character in this story, the one that does not speak but is present in every scene. Harlan Caldwell had kept that shop the way certain men keep the tools of their trade. Not neatly in the sense of things being arranged for appearance, but organized in the sense of things being exactly where they needed to be for the person who used them every day. The tools on the pegboard were in the order that matched the sequence of problems you encountered when you broke down a tractor. The bins of hardware were sorted by size and thread pitch. The shelves held manuals and parts catalogs going back to the 1930s, spines worn and pages marked. And in the back corner, under a canvas tarp that had been there since 1963, sat a metal lathe. Harlan had bought that lathe in 1947 from a man in Omaha who had used it in a small machine shop until the shop closed. It was not a large lathe. It was not a sophisticated lathe. But it was a real lathe with a solid cast iron bed and a tailstock that tracked true, and a compound rest that moved without slop. Harlan had used it maybe 5 times. Once to turn a bushing for a piece of equipment he could not find a replacement part for. Once to make a custom fitting for a homemade sprayer. A few other times for problems that required more precision than any other tool in the shop could provide. The cutting oil was still in the reservoir when Nora pulled the tarp off it in the fall of 1971. She checked the oil level, added a pint from a can on the shelf, and confirmed that the spindle still turned smoothly. She oiled the ways. She checked the chuck. She moved the tailstock back and forth along the bed until she was satisfied that it was still true. It was ready. It had been ready since 1963. It had simply been waiting for the right problem. The right problem was a pilot bore that needed to be machined to within 0.02 of an inch to accept the Oliver's transmission input shaft. A dimension so precise that there was only one tool in the shop that could achieve it. Her father had bought that tool in 1947 and used it perhaps 5 times. It had been waiting 24 years for this job. Nora covered the lathe back up with the canvas tarp and walked out of the shop into the September air. The Oliver 88 sat on its frame in the yard, stripped of its trailer chains resting on its cracked tires on the gravel. Frost would come in another month. She had a harvest to finish first. After harvest, the work would begin. And in the corner of Harlan's shop, The Continental F244 sat on its stand in the shadow and waited as it had been waiting for 14 months for the machine it had been chosen to power. The county was still laughing about the $40 tractor. Nora Caldwell was already thinking about adapter plates. Have you ever known what you were doing while everyone around you was absolutely certain that you did not? Have you ever carried a plan that you could not show anyone yet because the plan only makes sense when it is finished? There is a particular kind of patience that requires, not the patience of waiting without purpose, the patience of working towards something that only you can see the shape of. That is what the fall of 1971 was for Nora Caldwell. She finished the corn. She sold at the elevator when the price reached what she had written in her ledger as acceptable. She bedded the cattle for winter. She serviced the equipment that needed servicing and deferred the expenses that could wait. And every evening when the day's work was done and the light over the western fields had gone from gold to gray to nothing, she walked to the shop, lit the overhead light, and looked at the Continental engine on its stand. She had one more month of farm work left, one more month before harvest was finished and the cattle were settled and the fields were put to rest for the winter. Then she would begin. Frank Stover had called it the most expensive firewood in Shelby County. By the time Nora was done with it, it would be the most consequential $40 ever spent in this county. But that part of the story was still 11 months away, and it would happen in the quiet of a shop that a dead man had built with tools that carried the grip marks of 3 generations in the dark of Iowa winters, far from any audience that could have understood what it meant. The county kept laughing. Nora kept working. The first hard frost came to Shelby County on the 14th of October, 1971. It came in the night the way frost always comes without announcement, laying itself down across the fields while the county slept. By morning, the ground had a white crust that crunched under boots, and the water in the stock tanks had a thin skin of ice that the cattle broke through with their noses. The corn was in. The soybeans were in. The fields were done. Nora Caldwell walked to the shop before breakfast. She unlocked the side door, the one that faced the equipment yard, and she stood for a moment in the doorway, letting her eyes adjust to the interior light. The shop smelled the way her father's shop had always smelled. Oil and iron and the faint ghost of the wood stove's last fire. She walked to the overhead light pull chain and the fluorescent tubes buzzed and flickered and settled into their cold white light. The Continental F244 sat on its stand in the corner where it had been sitting for 14 months. The Oliver 88 sat in the center of the shop floor, where she had rolled it 2 weeks earlier, positioned under the chain hoist that hung from the ceiling beam her father had installed in 1952, specifically to handle engine work. Nora put on her work gloves, poured water into the coffee percolator on the shelf, and started taking the Oliver apart. She stripped it methodically the way her father had taught her. Every bolt went into a labeled container. Every bracket was set aside in the sequence it had come off. She laid the parts on the shop floor to the left and right of the frame, in the order of their removal, creating a map of the machine that she could read back in reverse when the time came to reassemble it. Harlan had drilled this into her from the time she was 11 years old. You lay it out so you can put it back. You don't pile it. You don't throw it in a bucket. You lay it out so you can read it. The frame was solid. 30 years of Iowa weather had not touched the main rails. Oliver had used heavy channel iron, and it was straight and true in a way that the sheet metal surrounding it was not. Nora wire brushed the frame rails down to clean metal, primed them with red oxide primer from a can on the shelf, and painted them Oliver green, not for appearance, because bare metal rusts and rusted metal is waste, and waste was the enemy of everything she was trying to do. She pulled the rear-end transmission final drives and differential as a single assembly and set the unit on wooden blocks. She drained the old oil which came out of the drain plug the color of used coffee grounds and smelled worse. She split the case and spread the components across the workbench. The gears were perfect, not worn in the way that says it has been used hard and is still acceptable. Perfect in the way that says the metallurgist who specified this alloy and the machinist who cut these teeth knew exactly what they were doing. The bull gears in those final drives showed no measurable wear after 23 years of fieldwork. The tooth faces were clean. The bearing surfaces were smooth. There was no pitting, no chipping, no scoring. Oliver had built this drivetrain to last longer than the tractor that surrounded it, and that is precisely what had happened. The sheet metal had rusted. The hydraulics had seized. The clutch had worn through. But the gears that actually did the work of turning power into motion through the Iowa soil had simply waited preserved in their original geometry for someone to give them more to do, more. Nora replaced the bearings $34 from the parts counter at the Napa in Harlan. She replaced the seals $12. She reassembled the transmission with fresh oil and set it aside. She ordered new clutch friction discs from an Oliver parts dealer in Minnesota, $28 plus freight. She rebuilt the hydraulic pump with a seal kit that cost $8 and an afternoon of careful work. She worked evenings. After the cattle were fed and the daily farm tasks were done, she changed into her shop clothes and went to work on the Oliver. Some evenings she had 3 hours. Some evenings she had 1. She did not hurry. Hurrying in a machine shop is how you make mistakes that cost you a season. December came. The wood stove in the corner of the shop worked steadily against the Iowa cold. The radio on the shelf played the evening farm report, and then whatever music the station chose to run after it. Nora worked in the light and warmth of the shop, while the temperature outside dropped, and the fields froze solid, and Shelby County settled into the particular silence of a Midwestern winter. And then she got to the adapter plate. Let me tell you what the adapter plate meant, because this is the piece that everything else depended on. The Continental F244 and the Oliver 88 drivetrain were not designed to work together. They were made by different companies in different eras for different purposes. Their mating surfaces did not align. The bolt patterns were different. The pilot bore dimensions were different. The flywheel housing faces were different geometries. To connect the Continental's output to the Oliver's transmission input, Nora needed to fabricate a plate of precise steel that would bridge those differences exactly. Not approximately. Not close enough. Exactly. A misaligned adapter plate would introduce angular error into the drivetrain. Angular error in a drivetrain means the transmission input shaft is running slightly off-center relative to the engine output. Running slightly off-center means the input bearing is taking a side load. It was never designed to take. A bearing taking a side load? It was never designed to take will fail. Not immediately. But within a season of real field work, the bearing would go. And when the bearing went, it would take the transmission with it. And a destroyed transmission on a tractor in the middle of planting season is not a mechanical problem. It is a financial catastrophe. The adapter plate had to be right. Nora bought a piece of 1-inch steel plate from a surplus dealer in Omaha, $11 for a section large enough for her purposes. She brought it to the shop and set it on the workbench. She had her measurements. She had her diagrams. She had the Continental on its stand, and the Oliver drivetrain on its blocks, and a measuring tape and a dial indicator that had belonged to her father. She marked out the bolt pattern for the Continental side with a scribe and a center punch. She marked out the bolt pattern for the Oliver side. She marked the center point for the pilot, bore the bore that would locate the plate precisely relative to both mating surfaces and which, if it was off by more than 0.02 of an inch, would introduce the angular error that would destroy the transmission. She drilled the bolt holes on her father's drill press, working carefully through each one. The drill press was not a machinist's tool. It was a farmer's drill press, adequate for most purposes, but not built for the kind of precision that the pilot bore required. The bolt holes were fine. The bolt holes had tolerance to spare. But the pilot bore was a different matter. That was the lathe's job. Nora had never operated the lathe professionally. She had watched her father use it perhaps a dozen times over the years. And she had used it herself once as a teenager, when Harlan had let her turn a practice piece to understand the tool, and once in her late 20s when she had needed to make a custom bushing, and had worked through the process slowly and carefully, and gotten it right on the third attempt. She had 2 months of winter evenings to get this right. She started with the setup. She mounted the adapter plate blank in the four-jaw chuck, indicating it true with the dial indicator, until the center point she had marked was running within 0.5 She checked the tailstock alignment. She checked the compound rest backlash. She oiled the ways and moved the carriage back and forth until she was satisfied that the machine was telling her the truth. Then she started cutting. She roughed the bore in steps, taking conservative cuts, measuring after each pass, letting the plate cool between cuts, so the heat of the cutting did not expand the metal and give her a false reading. She was boring toward a final dimension that she could not exceed. You can always take more material off. You cannot put it back. On the third evening of lathe work, after 3 hours of careful cutting, she took a measurement and got a number that was 0.03 larger than the number she had gotten an hour earlier from the same surface. She set down the micrometer. She looked at the plate in the chuck. She thought about what 0.03 of an inch of discrepancy meant. Either the plate had moved slightly in the chuck as the bore opened up, which was possible, or she had made a measuring error, which was also possible, or there was something she did not understand yet about what was happening. Which was the most concerning possibility? She stopped cutting. She let the plate sit overnight. The next evening, she indicated the plate true again from scratch and took 3 measurements at different points around the bore. The numbers told her the bore was not round. It was oval by 0.03. She had been applying too much cutting pressure from the tool, and the material had deflected slightly on one side. She had to start over with a new piece of plate. $11 more. She drove to Omaha on a Saturday morning and was back by noon. She set the new plate in the chuck that evening and started again from the beginning. This is the moment I want you to understand. Not the technical problem. Not the solution. The moment itself. January of 1972. The wood stove is burning. The radio is off because Nora has stopped listening to it. Outside the shop, the Iowa winter is doing what Iowa winters do, pressing down on everything with cold and silence, and the particular darkness of a flat land under a sky that has not shown the sun in a week. She is alone in a shop that her father built. She is holding a micrometer that her father owned. She is working on a problem that she designed for herself, that she told no one about, that the county considers a $40 mistake, if they consider it at all. She is 33 years old, and she has started over. She does not call Harold in Des Moines. She does not drive into town to ask anyone for advice. She pours another cup of coffee from the percolator, sits on the stool at the workbench, and looks at the new piece of plate in the chuck for a long time. Then she picks up her notes. She goes back through every measurement, every cut depth, every tool setting. She finds the place where the deflection started. She adjusts her approach. Lighter cuts, more passes, more patience. She starts again. Have you ever been in a shop or a workshop or a kitchen or an office late at night alone with a problem you could not hand to anyone else? The kind of problem that was yours specifically, that you had taken on voluntarily, that nobody had asked you to solve. And you had gotten it wrong once, and the getting it wrong had cost you something real. And you had to look at that cost and decide whether you were going to absorb it and continue, or set it down and walk away. That is what January of 1972 was for Nora Caldwell. Not a crisis, not a dramatic moment. Just a woman alone in a cold shop deciding quietly and without ceremony to continue. She finished the adapter plate on a Thursday evening in late January. The pilot bore measured within 1/1000th of an inch of her target dimension at 4 points around its circumference. She checked it twice. Then she checked it a third time. The numbers did not change. She set the plate on the workbench and looked at it for a moment. It was not beautiful. It was a circle of steel with holes in it. But it would put those two engines together with the precision that the transmission required. And that was the only beauty that mattered. She fabricated the engine mounts from 1/4-inch plate steel, cutting them on the bandsaw, drilling them on the drill press, welding them to the Oliver frame rails with her father's stick welder. She shimmed each mount with rubber pads, cut from a piece of old conveyor belt to absorb vibration. She adapted the throttle linkage from steel rod. She plumbed a new fuel line from the Oliver's original tank, adding an inline filter she had pulled from a junk truck at the salvage yard south of town. She adapted the Oliver's original radiator to the Continental's water pump. With a combination of hose and clamps and an aluminum fitting, she turned on the lathe. In an afternoon, the lathe now feeling familiar in a way it had not when she began. She rewired the electrical system. New ignition components. New starter solenoid. New voltage regulator. $31 from the auto parts store in Harlan. She found used rear tires at a dealer in Council Bluffs. Tread still on them. $50 the pair. She mounted them herself. For a seat, she pulled a unit from a scrapped Alice Chalmers at a farm sale east of town. The seat was orange. The tractor was green. Nora bolted the orange seat to the green tractor without a moment of hesitation. The seat was solid, and it was free, and those were the only two qualifications that mattered. Total cost $40 for the Oliver, $60 for the skid loader engine, $67 in engine rebuild parts, $46 for transmission bearings and seals, $28 for clutch discs, $8 for the hydraulic kit, $11 for the adapter plate steel, $31 for electrical, $50 for tires, $19 in miscellaneous hardware and fittings, $360, 11 months of evenings and weekends, one woman, one shop, her father's tools. She mated the engine to the transmission on a Thursday evening in late winter. The Continental slid into the Oliver frame on its custom mounts with a firmness that told her the geometry was right before any measuring instrument could confirm it. She torqued the adapter plate bolts to spec. She connected the fuel line, the throttle linkage, the electrical system, the cooling system. She filled the engine with fresh oil. She filled the radiator. She did not start it that night. She went through the entire assembly one more time, checking every connection, every fitting, every wire. She found two things she wanted to adjust and adjusted them. Then she covered the machine with a canvas tarp and went to bed. On a Saturday morning in August of 1972, Nora Caldwell turned the key on the Oliver 88. The Continental turned over twice. It coughed once the way a cold engine coughs when it has been sitting drawing fuel through passages that have been dry. Then it caught. The idle that settled into the shop was not the idle of an Oliver 88. It was deeper, fuller, heavier in a way that you felt in the floor through the soles of your boots before you processed it through your ears. The sound of 244 cubic inches breathing through an exhaust pipe that had been designed for 231. It was technically wrong for an Oliver. It was precisely right for what it was. Nora sat on the orange seat and watched the gauges come up. Oil pressure, water temperature, ammeter, all of them moving to where they belonged and staying there. She felt the frame through the seat for vibration. There was none. The adapter plate was true. The mounts were solid. The engine sat in that Oliver frame with the steadiness of something that had always been there. She let it warm for 10 minutes. Then she drove it out of the shop and into the August morning. She hooked up a 4-bottom plow. The original Oliver 88 with its factory engine could work a 3-bottom through heavy Iowa clay with reasonable confidence. A 4-bottom was possible, but the engine would tell you about it. You would feel the RPMs drop slightly as the load came on. You would see the front wheels get light as the tractor reached for traction. It was work the machine could do, but you would know it was working. Nora set the 4-bottom into the east field, opened the throttle, and the Continental pulled all 4 bottoms through the black Iowa soil without a change in its exhaust note. No hesitation, no lug, no complaint. The front wheels stayed down. The engine ran at the same steady note it had been running since she came off the headland. 12 horsepower does not sound like a large number. In a field in clay with a load on the drawbar, 12 horsepower is the difference between a tractor that is working and a tractor that is doing what it was built to do with capacity to spare. The difference between strain and authority, between adequate and sufficient. The Continental was not straining. Gene Tilson was combining soybeans in the field directly to the north. He had been watching from his combine cab since Nora came off the headland. After her 3rd pass, he shut the combine header down and climbed to the ground and drove his pickup to the fence line and waited. Nora saw him at the fence on her 4th pass and brought the Oliver to the headland and idled down. Gene stood at the fence with his hands on the top wire and looked at the tractor. He looked at it the way farmers look at things that are making them revise something they thought they understood. "That does not sound like an Oliver engine," he said. "It is not." Gene looked at the 4-bottom, at the depth of the furrows, at the consistent width of the slices. "What is it?" "Continental F244. 14 months of evenings." Gene was quiet for a moment. How much did the whole thing cost? $360. Gene Tilson farmed 400 acres with 2 John Deere 4020 tractors that had cost him $6,500 each. He was looking at a tractor pulling a 4-bottom through heavy Iowa clay for $360. He was not a man who made quick calculations. He was a man who made correct ones, and the calculation he was doing at that fence line was taking a moment. "Your father would have appreciated this," he said finally. "He would have told me the paint was uneven." Gene looked at the orange seat on the green tractor, and something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly. The expression of a man who has just understood a joke that is also not a joke. He drove back to his combine. The word spread, but it spread differently than the laughter had spread the year before. That had traveled fast, the way jokes travel, feeding on the pleasure of a shared amusement. This traveled the way field reports travel among farmers, carefully, from one man who had seen it to another man who needed to know. Gene told the man at the grain elevator in October. The man at the elevator told the elevator manager. The elevator manager mentioned it to 2 farmers who came in that week. One of those farmers drove past the Caldwell place on a different road than usual to see if there was an Oliver 88 in the field. There was. By December, 3 men had driven to the farm to see the tractor for themselves. They came with questions about the Continental engine and the adapter plate and the cost of the parts. Nora answered their questions directly and without elaboration. By the spring of 1973, 2 of those 3 men had come back with a different kind of question. The first was Dale Phelps. Dale farmed 160 acres east of Harlan. He had a 1950 Farmall M that had been burning oil for 2 seasons and was losing compression steadily, the way an engine loses compression when the rings have given up and the cylinder walls have followed. The engine was not dead yet, but it was describing its own death in detail every time it started in the morning. Dale had gotten a quote from the dealer for a rebuilt original engine. $900. He had priced a new tractor. $8,000 and financing. He had heard about the Oliver. Nora found a Continental engine at a surplus auction in Des Moines that spring. She built the adapter plate on her father's drill press and lathe over 3 weekends. She had the farmall running on the new engine in 6 weeks. She charged Dale $150 for labor. He supplied the parts. Total cost to Dale, including the surplus engine, was under $500. The rebuilt original from the dealer would have been $900. The new tractor would have been $8,048 months of payments. Dale drove home in a tractor that made more power than it had when it came from the factory for $500 total, with no payment book in the glove compartment. The second conversion followed 3 months later, then a third, then a fourth. Nora never placed an advertisement. She never sought work. The work found her the way water finds the lowest available point, by following the natural slope of the land without effort and without deviation. A farmer would mention her name to another farmer. That farmer would mention it at the co-op. Someone at the co-op would tell his neighbor who had a machine that was costing more to keep running than it could justify. And eventually a man would appear in Nora's yard with his hat in his hands and a tired tractor behind his truck, asking if what he had heard was true. It was true. Frank Stover noticed. How could he not? Frank's dealership sold new John Deere equipment. Frank's service department repaired machines that needed professional attention. The farmers who were coming to Nora Caldwell with their tired iron were the same farmers who should have been coming to Frank with financing applications and trade-in valuations. Every Farmall M that left the Caldwell farm with a rebuilt Continental engine was a tractor that Frank had not sold a replacement for. Every farmer who paid Nora $150 in labor was a farmer who had not financed $8,000 through Frank's dealership. In October of 1972, Frank drove to the Caldwell farm. He parked his truck in the yard and knocked on the shop door. Nora was working on a grain auger motor and came to the door with grease on her hands. Frank was wearing his vest and his leather-heeled boots. He had a way of standing that communicated that he considered the ground he was standing on to be slightly less appropriate than where he usually stood. He said he had heard about the Oliver and was curious about the mechanical approach. He asked a few questions about the Continental engine and the adapter plate, which Nora answered. Then he looked around the shop and looked at the farmyard and looked at the house and said what he had actually come to say. 200 acres is a significant operation for one person to manage alone, Miss Caldwell. I know people who would pay a fair price for this ground. Good people who would put it to productive use. If you ever wanted to think about a different situation for yourself. Nora set the auger motor housing on the workbench and looked at Frank. Are you here about a mechanical question or a real estate question? Frank smiled the way he smiled when a conversation was not going the direction he had intended. Just making conversation, he said. The gate is behind you, Nora said. She picked up the auger motor and went back to work. Frank left. He did not go away. A man like Frank Stover does not go away from a situation he has not resolved to his satisfaction. He simply changed his approach. He began mentioning Nora's operation in conversations around the county, in a way that sounded like acknowledgement but was actually something else. She does good work, he would say. Old school approach. Works for some people, but there is a ceiling on what that kind of operation can do. You get to a point where the equipment cannot keep up with the scale the market is demanding. Frank had a gift for planting doubt without appearing to plant anything at all. The county listened to Frank because Frank had been right about enough things often enough to have earned that attention. The farmers who had bought 4 020s and 4 320s were running bigger operations than their fathers had. The yields were higher. The acreage they could manage had expanded. Frank's argument was not wrong in the abstract. New equipment with modern engineering could do things that old equipment could not. That was simply true. What Frank's argument did not account for was the cost of financing that new equipment in a market where crop prices moved independently of equipment payments. What the argument did not account for was what happened when the crop price dropped and the payment did not. But in 1974 and 1975 and 1976, with corn at $3.20 a bushel, and the expansion years of the early 70s still feeling recent, Frank's argument had the comfort of recent evidence behind it. And Nora Caldwell's approach looked like it might simply be the stubbornness of a woman who had grown up in a particular kind of household and had not yet been shown why that household's way of doing things had limits. The summer of 1979 was the Chickasaw County Fair. Frank had arranged a demonstration of the new John Deere 4440 at the fairgrounds, a machine that represented the current state of what John Deere believed a modern tractor should be. It was a large, clean, powerful piece of equipment, and Frank had brought it to the fair because a fair is the right place to show things to the maximum number of people at once. The 4440 ran through a demonstration pull on the fairgrounds, with 5 plow bottoms through ground that had been prepared for the purpose. It was an impressive demonstration. The machine was capable, and it looked like what a capable machine was supposed to look like in 1979. The crowd watched, and several men asked questions, and Frank answered them with the fluency of a man who had been answering these questions for nearly 2 decades. Nora was in the crowd. She had come to the fair for other reasons, and had walked past the demonstration area and stopped as you stop when something occupies the space you are walking through. Frank saw her. "Miss Caldwell," he said. He said it loudly enough for the people around them to hear. Still running that $40 experiment, Nora looked at the 4440, at its size, at its paint, at the way it sat in the fairground light like an advertisement for itself. "How many payments left on it?" Frank smiled his dealership smile, the one that was designed to make the person across from him feel that the question they had just asked was slightly beside the point. He did not answer. Gene Tilson was standing 6 feet away. He heard every word. He looked at Frank, and then he looked at Nora. And then he looked at the 4440. He had been making payments on his own. $4,020 for 7 years. He had 17 months left. He had not slept well in the spring of 1977, when corn dropped to $2.40, and the payment had not dropped with it. He understood the question Nora had asked in a way that Frank apparently did not want to engage with publicly. The fair crowd moved on to other attractions. Nora walked back to where she had parked her truck. The years between 1972 and 1981 were the years of building. Nora farmed her 200 acres in rotation corn and beans the way the county had always farmed, and she ran 30 head of cattle on the grass ground. Her yields were middle of the county average. Her costs were the lowest in the county by a margin that she tracked in her ledger every season, and that she did not discuss with anyone. She put money away every year. $7,000 in a good year, $4,000 in a bad one. Not a fortune, not even a large number relative to the scale of operations that Frank Stover's customers were running, but consistent, present in the bank account the way water is present in a well that is properly dug, always there when you need it. By 1981, the account had $91,000 in it. Then the weather changed. Not the actual weather, though, that changed too. The financial weather. The kind of weather that builds for years before it arrives, and that announces itself not with a single storm, but with a series of smaller events that are easy to explain individually and devastating in aggregate. Interest rates climbed through 1980 and into 1981. They did not stop at a place that felt temporary. They went to 18% and stayed. They went to 20%. The Federal Reserve was fighting inflation with the instrument it had, and the instrument it had was the price of borrowing money. And it used that instrument without apology. For farmers who had financed equipment and land at the rates of the early 70s and were now refinancing or carrying variable rate debt, the numbers stopped making sense in ways that were not recoverable by working harder or planting more acres. Corn dropped below $2 a bushel in 1982. Nora looked at the number in the grain elevator printout and looked at her ledger and looked at the number in her bank account and understood what was happening and what was going to happen over the next several years. She had lived on the thin edge of agriculture her entire adult life. She knew the arithmetic of farming at a molecular level. She knew that a farm operation built on borrowed money at 18% interest was not a question of whether it would fail. It was a question of when. Shelby County lost 11 farms between 1982 and 1987, 11 families, some of them 3 and 4 generations on the same ground. Gone. The banks did not want to foreclose. Foreclosure is not profitable for a bank, particularly when the land values have fallen by half, and the asset the bank takes possession of is worth less than the loan it secures. But a bank that has loaned money has a legal obligation to the money, and when the borrower cannot service the debt, the legal process begins regardless of anyone's preferences. Nora watched from a distance. She watched the auction notices appear in the paper. She watched neighbors she had known her entire life pack their families into trucks and leave farms that their grandparents had broken from prairie sod. She did not feel satisfaction. She did not feel vindicated. She felt the particular grief of watching something you understood be destroyed by something that was also in its own way understandable. She kept working. The Continental kept running. The Oliver kept turning the Iowa ground. In March of 1984, Gene Tilson called her on a Sunday morning. "You need to drive past Stover Equipment today," Gene said. Nora drove past Stover Equipment that afternoon on her way back from the feed store. The parking lot that had held demonstration tractors and the particular gleam of new paint was empty. The lights in the showroom were off. On the glass door there was a notice. It was a legal notice, the kind that a county clerk files and a process server tapes to a glass surface when the paperwork has reached the stage that requires public posting. Stover Equipment, Inc. had filed for Chapter 11 protection. Frank had guaranteed financing for too many customers during the expansion years. When those customers could no longer service their equipment loans, the guarantees became Frank's obligation. Frank had built his dealership on the assumption that the market conditions of the early 70s were the permanent conditions of the future. They were not. Nothing is permanent except the payment schedule, and the payment schedule does not renegotiate itself when the price of corn goes to $1.90. Nora sat in her truck in the parking lot of the closed dealership and looked at the notice on the door. She did not feel triumph. She thought about Frank's customers, the farmers who had signed the papers at his desk and driven home in something new and made the payments for as long as they could, and then could not anymore. They had trusted an argument that turned out to be wrong, and they had paid for that trust with their land. Frank had trusted the same argument. He had paid for it with his dealership. There is no satisfaction in watching a bad argument take everyone down with it. She drove home. The Oliver was in the yard when she pulled in. The Continental engine turned over on the first key turn the next morning the way it had every morning since August of 1972. Nora checked the oil, checked the coolant, listened to the idle for anything that was not right. Everything was right. She had put 1,100 hours on the engine since the rebuild, and it was running as cleanly as it had the day she first started it in the shop. Shelby County's financial weather had changed everything for everyone around her. For Nora Caldwell, it had changed nothing except the balance in her bank account, which had continued its quiet accumulation through every year that the crisis had been dismantling her neighbors. The ledger said $91,000. She closed the ledger and put it back on the shelf. The land to the south of her property was still producing corn. It was still black Iowa soil, flat and deep and honest in the way that the best farmland is honest. It had belonged to the Murdoch family for 3 generations. It was about to belong to whoever showed up with the right number on the right morning. That morning was coming. Nora knew it. She had been watching the notices in the paper for 3 years. She had been watching the auction listings the way you watch a weather system develop on the western horizon. You cannot stop it. You can be ready for it. She was ready. The notice appeared in the Shelby County paper on a Thursday morning in late August of 1985. Nora read it at the kitchen table with her coffee the way she read everything without hurry, with full attention, with the particular stillness of a person who has been expecting something and is now confirming that it has arrived. Farmers First Savings Bank of Harlan was offering for public auction 240 acres of farmland in the southern portion of Shelby County, Iowa. The parcel was bounded on the north by County Road L55, on the east by the Murdoch drainage easement, on the south and west by private property lines. The land was rated Class A and Class B soils by the county assessor. The auction would be held on the 22nd of October 1985 at the Grange Hall outside Harlan. Registration at 9 in the morning. Bidding to commence at 10. Nora folded the paper along its original crease and set it on the table. She went to the desk in the front room and opened the bottom drawer. She took out the ledger. She did not need to open it. She knew the number. But she opened it anyway because the ledger was how she kept herself honest, and she wanted to be honest about what she was considering. $91,000. She had been putting money away since 1965. 20 years of keeping costs at the floor of driving the Oliver, instead of financing something new of rebuilding, instead of replacing of holding grain in the bin when the price was wrong and selling when it was right. 20 years of the ledger telling the truth about every dollar that came in and every dollar that went out and every dollar that stayed. $91,000 was the physical residue of 20 years of arithmetic. She did some calculations on the back page of the ledger. 240 acres at various per-acre prices. What she would have left afterward. What the annual cash flow from that ground would look like at current corn prices. What the break-even number was per bushel at various input cost scenarios. She filled half a page with numbers, checked them, and filled the other half with the same numbers approached from a different direction to confirm they arrived at the same place. They did. She put the ledger back in the drawer. She drove to the Shelby County Savings Bank on the following Monday morning and spoke with the branch manager, a man named Clifford Oakes, who had managed that branch since 1971 and who knew Nora Caldwell the way a bank manager knows a depositor, who has never borrowed money and has never been anything but straightforward in every transaction. He confirmed what she needed to know about certified funds and the mechanics of payment at a county auction. She thanked him. She drove home. She told no one what she was planning. Not Jean Tilson, who was her nearest neighbor and had been watching her farm for 14 years. Not Harold, her brother in Des Moines, who called twice a year and asked general questions about how things were going. Not anyone at the co-op or the elevator or the diner on the highway where the farmers gathered on winter mornings to drink coffee and talk about things they could not control. There was no tactical reason for the silence. Nobody who knew Nora Caldwell would have tried to talk her out of anything she had already decided. The silence was simply her nature. She did not discuss plans that were not yet finished. She did not seek approval for decisions that were hers to make. She had lived this way since 1964, and it had served her without exception. October came in cool and dry, the best kind of Iowa. October, the kind that lets the harvest run without interruption and leaves the fields clean and the elevators full by the end of the month. Nora finished her corn on the 18th and her beans on the 20th, 2 days before the auction. She serviced the Oliver that evening, changed the oil, checked the air cleaner, greased the fittings, listened to the idle for anything that needed attention. The Continental ran without comment. 13 years and well over 14,000 hours since the first morning she had started it in the shop, and the engine had asked for nothing beyond normal maintenance. The oil came out clean. The idle was steady. The exhaust note was the same deep, unhurried sound. It had always been the sound of an engine that had found its purpose and was content in it. She put the Oliver in the shed and went inside. On the morning of October 22nd, Nora Caldwell drove to the Grange Hall outside Harlan. She arrived at 8:45, 15 minutes before registration opened. There were already 40 or 50 people in the parking lot. The usual mixture of farmers and land speculators and bank representatives and curious onlookers who come to major land auctions in small counties. Because a major land auction is one of the few public events where you can watch significant amounts of money change hands in real time. She registered at the table by the door and received her bidder number. She found a place to stand along the left wall of the main room, neither near the front nor at the back, just inside the clear sight line of the auctioneer's platform. She put her hands in the pockets of her canvas work jacket and waited. The room filled. By 10 o'clock, there were perhaps 120 people present, which was a substantial turnout for a county auction. But 240 acres of Class A and Class B soil in Shelby County was the kind of asset that drew serious attention from serious money. Several of the men in the room were not farmers. They were dressed in a way that was almost right for a farm auction, but not quite. The shoes were wrong. The fit of the clothing was wrong in the way that clothing is wrong when it has been chosen by someone who does not wear it regularly. These were investors or their representatives, men from Des Moines or Kansas City or Chicago, who followed the agricultural press and understood that distressed land in the Iowa river bottoms was a generational buying opportunity when the prices were right. In the back right corner of the room, standing slightly apart from the main crowd, was Frank Stover. Nora noticed him immediately. She had not expected him to be there, which was a failure of imagination on her part. Of course, Frank was there. Frank had spent 20 years in Shelby County agricultural commerce. He knew every piece of land in the county by its productivity rating and its drainage characteristics, and its relationship to the broader parcel geometries of the surrounding operations. He knew the Murdoch grounds specifically because he had tried to buy it himself in 1979. Through an investment arrangement with a partner in Ames, a deal that had fallen through for reasons that were no longer relevant. Frank had filed his bankruptcy and reorganized his personal finances and was now operating as a private agricultural investor rather than a dealership owner. He was older. The vest was gone. He wore a regular jacket and work boots that were newer than a farmer's but older than an investor's. The confidence was still there, but it was quieter now, shaped by the years since the closed dealership and the notice on the glass door. A man who has been loudly wrong about something important carries himself differently afterward. Not defeated, but recalibrated. He saw Nora when she registered. He looked at her the way you look at someone you have a complicated history with. And then he looked away. Bud Cressy was not calling this auction. Bud had retired from the circuit in 1983. The auctioneer was a younger man named Harv Pelton, who had been doing Shelby County sales for 8 years and had a clean, efficient style that moved things along without unnecessary theater. He called the auction to order at 10:02 and read the legal description of the parcel and the terms of sale, cash or certified funds, closing within 30 days of acceptance. The bank had clear title. Any questions before bidding commenced? There were no questions. Opening bid, Harv said. I am looking for $400 per acre. 240 acres at 400 is $96,000. Who wants to start us at 400? The room was quiet. 400 is the assessed value, Harv said. I know what the market has done. I am just opening the conversation. 400 from anyone. The room stayed quiet. The silence was not reluctance. It was strategy. In a distressed land auction in 1985, showing your number first was showing your hand, and experienced buyers did not show their hands in the first 30 seconds. 350, Harv said. Let us be reasonable. 350 per acre. A man near the front raised a card. He was one of the investors from the Chicago group. A heavy-set man in a jacket that was slightly too warm for the room. 350. 375, Harv said. Do I hear 375? The room moved. Two more cards went up in quick sequence and then settled back to the Chicago man and one other bidder, a local farmer from the northeastern part of the county who wanted the drainage access more than the ground itself. By 400, the local farmer had dropped out. By 425, it was the Chicago man and his associate trading the bid back and forth in the practiced rhythm of two people who had agreed on their ceiling before walking in the door. 450, Harv called. 450 anywhere. We are at 425 from the Chicago group. Nora said, 450. It was not a loud voice. It did not need to be. The room was already quiet with the specific attention that forms around serious bidding, and her voice carried to every corner without effort. The Chicago man turned around. He saw the woman in the canvas work jacket standing along the left wall. He looked at his associate. His associate made a small movement with his head that was not quite a nod and not quite a shrug, but contained both. 475, the Chicago man said. 500, Nora said. The room had gone completely still. Not the polite quiet of an auction in progress, but the deep attention of a room that understands it, is watching something it will be talking about for years. Frank Stover in the back right corner had straightened up from the wall he had been leaning against. He was watching Nora with an expression that had moved past surprise into something more complex. The Chicago man spoke quietly with his associate. The conversation lasted perhaps 15 seconds. 500 was above their ceiling. Nora knew it would be before she said the number the way you know certain things about the arithmetic of other people's arrangements. If you have spent enough time thinking about the arithmetic of your own. The Chicago group had come with a specific investment thesis. That thesis had a maximum per acre number built into it. The thesis did not survive the Iowa soil at $500 per acre in 1985, with corn under $2 a bushel. A farmer who owned the land outright and had no financing costs could make $500 per acre work. An investor carrying any cost of capital at all could not. The Chicago man shook his head at his associate. The associate lowered his card. Harv Pelton looked around the room. He waited the appropriate time. $500 per acre. I have 500 from the bidder on the left wall. Do I hear 525? 510. 501. Anybody? Nobody. Sold, Harv said. 240 acres, Shelby County, to the bidder on the left wall for $500 per acre. That is $120,000. Method of payment. Certified funds, Nora said. I have the check with me. She had gone to the bank on the previous Friday and obtained a cashier's check for $120,000. She had the additional funds in her account to cover the amount above her running balance. She had arranged this 3 weeks before the auction, on the same day she completed her calculations in the back of the ledger. She had not told anyone, not because it was a secret, because it was simply not finished yet, and she did not discuss things that were not finished. She walked to the auctioneer's table and presented the check. Harv Pelton looked at the check and looked at Nora, and looked back at the check with the expression of a man confirming that what he is seeing is what he thinks he is seeing. He handed the check to the bank representative at the table. The bank representative examined it. He nodded. The paperwork took 20 minutes. When Nora walked back toward the door with her copy of the sale agreement, the room was doing what rooms do after they have witnessed something that requires processing. People were talking in small groups, recalculating things they thought they had understood about their county and the people in it. Gene Tilson found her near the door. He had been in the room the entire time. He had not bid. He had not been planning to bid. He had come because he had heard the parcel was coming to auction, and he believed that a man who farms 400 acres adjacent to the parcels in question should know what is happening to those parcels. He looked at her for a moment. He looked at the sale agreement in her hand. "That is $120,000, he said. Nora folded the agreement and put it in her jacket pocket. "That is 14 years of not making payments, Gene." Gene took his cap off and held it in both hands the way men hold their caps when they are thinking about something that deserves the full weight of their attention. "You have been building toward this since the Oliver." "I have been building toward this since my father died," Nora said. The Oliver was just the place where the arithmetic started making sense to other people. Gene put his cap back on. "The land to the south is yours now." "It is." "Your father knew this was how it worked. He knew that a paid-for tractor and a paid-for field are the only things a bank cannot take from you. The rest follows from that if you pay attention long enough." They stood there for a moment, two farmers in a room that was thinning out around them. The Chicago group already heading for the parking lot, and their vehicles with out-of-state plates. The local farmers moving in clusters toward the door. "Gene said I sold one of the 402s last year." "I know," Nora said. "Made a payment with it." "I know. Should have listened to you in 1971. You weren't wrong about the machine, Gene. You were wrong about the payment." "There is a difference." Gene nodded. It was the nod of a man who has understood something in full for the first time, even though he has been approaching it from various angles for many years. He walked to his truck. Frank Stover waited until the room had cleared to approach Nora. He came across the emptied floor with a deliberateness that said he had decided to have this conversation and was going to have it regardless of any awkwardness. He stopped a few feet away. He looked older than she remembered him looking, though she had seen him at various distances around the county over the years since the dealership closed. The confidence that had once filled every room he entered had been replaced by something more considered. Not absence of confidence, calibrated confidence. The kind that survives being wrong about something major and comes out the other side having learned to measure itself more carefully. "I was wrong about you," Frank said. 3 words, no performance in them, no request for anything. Nora looked at him. She had thought about this moment in the abstract over the years, not obsessively, but occasionally the way you sometimes think about conversations that have not happened yet and consider what they might contain. "I know," she said. She extended her hand. Frank shook it. The handshake lasted the appropriate time for two people who had been adversaries for 14 years and were now simply two people standing in an emptied room after a significant transaction. Frank picked up his jacket from the chair he had draped it over and walked to the door. He pushed it open and the October light came in for a moment, and then the door closed and he was gone. Nora never saw Frank Stover again. Not because anything ended badly. Nothing ended badly. Two people had approached the same landscape from opposite directions and arrived at different destinations. And on one October morning in 1985, had stood in the same room and acknowledged that the journey was over, and the results were what they were. Frank went on to other things in other places. Nora went on to the same things in the same place, which was precisely the point. She drove south on the county road after leaving the Grange Hall and parked on the gravel shoulder at the northern boundary of the 240 acres she had just bought. She got out of the truck and stood at the edge of the field. The corn on that ground had been harvested the previous week by a custom operator the bank had hired. The stubble was even and the field was clean in the way that fields are clean in late October. Stripped back to the essentials. Nothing pretending to be more than what it is. She looked at the field for a long time. The ground ran flat and dark to the southern tree line where the drainage easement marked the property boundary. 240 acres of Class A and Class B soil in Shelby County, Iowa, paid for in full, owing nothing to anyone on earth. She thought about Harlan, not about what he would have said, because she knew what he would have said, and she had been carrying those words for 20 years. She thought about his hands, the grip marks in the wrench handles, the way he moved in the shop, slow and deliberate, never wasting a motion, never hurrying toward a conclusion that needed to arrive at its own speed. She thought about the workbench he had built from oak planks that she had worked at every evening for 11 months in 1971 and 1972. She thought about the lathe he had bought in 1947 and used 5 times and kept ready. Some things are kept ready for 20 years before the right problem arrives. She got back in the truck and drove home. The combined 440 acres of the Caldwell farm ran from the county road to the drainage easement 200 acres of what Harlan had broken, and 240 acres of what Nora had bought with the savings that came from everything Harlan had taught her. It was in the way that matters most in a farming county complete. A piece of ground that made sense in its own geometry, that had enough scale to support serious operation, that was owned outright by the person who farmed it. The Oliver 88 worked that ground for 16 more years. The Continental F244 did not fail. It did not require a rebuild. It required oil changes and valve adjustments, and the occasional minor repair that any honest engine requires over a long service life. And it received those things from Nora's hands, in Harlan's shop on the schedule that the engine's performance dictated. By 2001, when Nora walked away from the daily operation of the farm, the Continental had logged somewhere above 14,000 hours on the adapter plate she had machined on the lathe in January of 1972. The Oliver's transmission, the bull gears and final drives that had been perfect when she split the case in the winter of 1971, had never required anything beyond the seal replacements that routine maintenance demanded. Oliver's engineers had built that drivetrain to outlast everything around it, and that is precisely what it had done. In the spring of 2001, Nora Caldwell was 63 years old. Harold's daughter Lynn had been coming to the farm every summer since she was 12, learning the fields and the cattle and the shop in the way that certain young people learn things when they have found the place where they belong. Lynn was 30 years old that spring. She had a farmer's hands and a farmer's instinct for what a piece of equipment was telling you when it ran with any deviation from its normal note. Nora sat with Lynn at the kitchen table on an April evening and went through the ledger page by page, every field, every piece of equipment, every account, every arrangement with every buyer and seller and service provider the farm had relationships with. The session lasted 3 evenings. Lynn asked questions when something was unclear and listened without interruption when something was being explained. On the 4th evening, Nora handed Lynn the ledger. She did not make a speech about it. She did not outline her philosophy or summarize what she hoped Lynn would carry forward. The ledger said everything a ledger could say, which was the truth about every dollar that had moved through the operation for 37 years. The rest was in the shop, in the tools, in the Oliver, running in the shed, in the fields, whose behavior Nora had learned season by season, until she knew them the way you know the people you have lived with for decades, their tendencies and their moods, and the things they needed that they could not ask for directly. Lynn took the ledger and put it on the shelf where Nora had always kept it. The shop was hers now. The fields were hers now. The Oliver was hers now. Harlan's workbench was still where it had always been. The vise was still bolted where it had been bolted since 1919. The tools on the pegboard were in the order that matched the sequence of problems you encountered when you broke down a tractor. Lynn had spent enough summers in that shop to know the order without thinking about it. In the fall of 2003, the Shelby County Farm Bureau held its annual dinner at the Grange Hall outside Harlan, the same Grange Hall where 18 years earlier, a woman in a canvas work jacket had handed a certified check to a bank representative and changed the geometry of her farm forever. The Farm Bureau had invited Nora to speak. She had almost declined. She had never spoken publicly about her operation, not because she had anything to hide, but because she did not think of herself as someone who had lessons to deliver to rooms full of people. She farmed. She kept the ledger honest. She paid for what she used. These did not seem like things that required explanation. Lynn convinced her to go. Nora arrived at the dinner and sat at a table near the side and ate the meal that was served and listened to the other speakers who spoke before her. When it was her turn, she walked to the front of the room with a single index card that she had written 3 sentences on. She read the first sentence from the card. Then she put the card in her pocket and spoke without it. People have been asking me for 30 years how I built a tractor for $360. That is the wrong question. The right question is why everyone else paid $6,500 for the same capability. She paused. I did not do anything special. I looked at what I had. I looked at what I needed. I found the least expensive line between those 2 points. That is not cleverness. That is arithmetic. She looked at the room. Farmers and their wives. Some of them people she had known her entire life. Some of them the children of people she had known her entire life. A few faces she recognized from the 1985 auction, standing in the same Grange Hall where they had watched her present a certified check and gone home to recalculate things. My father taught me that a tool is only as expensive as the problem it solves. If the problem costs $360 to solve, then $6,500 is not a better solution. It is a more expensive mistake. She let that sit for a moment. I bought 240 acres in 1985 with cash. Cash I had saved because my tractor cost $360 instead of $6,500. Because my repairs cost parts and time rather than dealer invoices. Because my fuel and maintenance costs were half what they would have been with newer, larger, more expensive equipment that did the same work mine did. Another pause. People looked at my tractor and saw junk. I looked at their payment books and saw the same thing. The room was completely quiet. She stepped away from the podium. There was a moment of silence that lasted long enough to be something other than the gap before applause. It was the silence of people absorbing something that had just been said with such plainness that the plainness itself required a moment to process. Then the room was not quiet. Gene Tilson was at a table near the back. He was 72 years old and had been retired from active farming for 3 years. He had sold both of his John Deere 4020s in 1983 and 1985 to make loan payments, and he had farmed with rented equipment for the last years of his operation, which had worked adequately, but had never sat right with him in the way that rented equipment never sits entirely right with a man who was raised to own what he used. He had spent those years understanding in the slow and thorough way that experience teaches exactly what Nora had understood. in the fast and thorough way that arithmetic teaches. After the dinner, Gene found Nora in the parking lot. The October air was cool, and the stars were clear above the flat Iowa horizon. He had his jacket on and his cap pushed back, and the expression of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has decided tonight is the night to set it down. $360, he said. $360, she said. I paid $13,000 for 2 tractors that are both gone. You paid $360 for one that is still running. She looked at him. It is not about the tractors, Gene. It never was. I know that now. Do you? He thought about it. He was not a man who answered questions he had not fully considered. It is about owning what you use, he said. If you own your tools, you own your time. If you own your time, you own your future. If the bank owns your tools, they own all 3. He paused. I just needed 30 years and 2 repossessions to understand what you figured out before you were 35. Nora looked at the parking lot, at the farm trucks and the few cars, at the flat western sky above the fields that were dark now, resting under the October stars. You understood it fine, she said. You just trusted someone who was very confident that it did not apply to you. That happens to careful people too. Gene was quiet for a moment. Your father raised a good farmer. My father raised someone who pays attention. The farming part followed from that. They stood for a moment in the parking lot. 2 people who had been neighbors for 32 years watching the same ground from opposite sides of the fence, arriving finally at the same place in the conversation that they had been having since August of 1972, when Gene had shut his combine down and driven to the fence line and watched 4 plow bottoms move through Iowa clay behind an engine that did not belong to the tractor. It was running. Your niece, Jean, said. She is running it right. She is running it the way it ought to be run. The Oliver still out there. The Oliver is still out there. Gene nodded. He put his hand out. Nora shook it. They walked to their separate trucks. Lynn Caldwell farms the 440 acres today. She farms them the way Nora farmed them and the way Harlan farmed them before that, carefully and in cash with a ledger that tells the truth about every dollar, and a shop that holds the tools of 3 generations arranged in the order that makes sense to a person who uses them daily. The Oliver 88 is in the shed where it has always been. The Continental F244 engine that Nora pulled from a Carroll County skid loader in July of 1970 and rebuilt on the workbench in the winter of 1971 still starts on the first attempt on cold mornings. The adapter plate that took 3 weekends and 1 false start, and the full capacity of a lathe that had been waiting 24 years for the right problem, is still connecting that engine to the Oliver's transmission. The bull gears in the final drives that Nora judged perfect when she split the case in the winter of 1971 are still turning, still meeting spec, still doing exactly what Oliver's engineers designed them to do in 1948. Harlan's workbench is still where it has always been. The vise is still bolted where it has been since 1919. Lynn's oldest boy is 14. He is learning the drill press. He is learning the lathe. He is learning to read the ledger and understand what it says about the difference between cost and value, between what something is worth and what something costs, between a tool that is paid for and a tool that is paying someone else. He will understand it completely by the time he needs to. That is how it has always worked in this shop, in this county, on this ground. Let me ask you something before we are done. When you look at a rusted machine behind a collapsed barn, what do you see? Most people see the end of something. A machine that has given what it had to give and been left where it stopped. Scrap value. Nostalgia. A photograph. Something that belongs to a past that is not coming back. The auctioneer saw $25 in cast iron. The salvage man saw a load he did not want to haul. The county saw a $40 punchline. Frank Stover saw the most expensive firewood in Shelby County. Nora Caldwell saw a drivetrain that Oliver's best engineers had overbuilt by a comfortable margin. She saw a set of bull gears machined to tolerances that were waiting for more power than they had ever received. She saw a transmission that would outlast every other component of the machine by decades. She saw a frame that was straight and true and would accept a Continental engine if the mounting was built correctly, and the adapter plate was machined to within 1/1000th of an inch. She saw her father's shop. She saw her father's lathe, waiting 24 years for the right problem. She saw $360 in 11 months of evenings. She saw 240 acres of Iowa black soil that nobody had offered for yet. That is the difference between a person who sees what something is and a person who sees what something could become. A buyer looks at a price and pays it. A builder looks at what the world has discarded and understands what it is still capable of. Nora Caldwell paid $40 for a machine the county laughed at. She spent $320 more in 11 months of her evenings building it into a tractor that outpulled machines costing $6,500. She farmed 440 paid-for acres for 30 years. She saved $91,000 while her neighbors saved nothing. She bought 240 acres at auction, while the men who had laughed at her were standing in other auction crowds, watching their own land sell for whatever the bank would accept. She ran that Continental engine for more than 14,000 hours without a major repair. She passed a 440-acre paid-for farm to the next generation, with no debt, no mortgage, no equipment loans, and no payments of any kind owed to any institution on earth. They said nobody wanted that tractor. Nora Caldwell wanted it. And when the county finally understood what it had watched for 14 years, not just the plowing, not just the power, not just the $360 against $6,500, but the $91,000 in the bank account, and the 240 acres at auction, and the Continental still running after everything else in the yard had been replaced twice over. They understood what Nora had known from the moment she said $40 in the Shelby County auction yard on a Tuesday morning in September of 1971. The most expensive tractor in the county is not the one that costs the most. It is the one you are still making payments on when the land next door goes to auction.